This evening, participants will understand the power school boards have to influence and impact equity in school districts. Participants will understand how school boards can be drivers of student achievement. Participants will know how to assess whether or not their school board is spending its time on topics that influence student outcomes and achievement. Participants will know how to find their district's policies. Participants will be able to determine if their district's policies promote equity or reinforce inequities.
So exciting to see so many of you from so many places. So I am excited to dive into our conversation tonight with Ethan and Carrie and AJ. But to start with, we're going to give a quick 3-minute overview about what school boards do. And so for a little context, we did a whole hour-and-a-half session on this a couple weeks ago. So we know there's a lot we could talk about what school boards do, but we want to just cover the basics here so that we all have a similar understanding of what school boards are responsible for before we can get into a deeper conversation. So I think Nona's going to share our screen, so we can have some visuals for those people who learn better by seeing. So to start with, at the most basic, the board governs your district while your administration manages it. So that means that the board determines the what, the big picture, and your administration is going to determine the how, the day-to-day operations of your school district. And so as it says here, though, the board and administration work together to co-create the vision, the goals, the priorities for your district. But then, what we do from there, though, is that the board is going to establish the policies, the fiscal practices that are going to help reach that vision. But the administration is going to be responsible for allocating the resources and doing those day-to-day operations of a district, also in service to those goals and to those priorities. So that's what we mean when we say governance and what we mean when we say management. So really quickly, we're going to get into a little bit about the main responsibilities of a school board. So first and foremost, it's policymaking. So your boards are going to revise current policies and write new ones. That's a huge responsibility of a board. They also oversee and approve the budget, or as you might hear often from your school board members, they're supposed to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So that's another big role they have. And then, as many constituents don't know, or maybe didn't know until it started making headlines, school boards approve curriculum, and that includes textbooks in many school districts. So that's another really important role they play. And then it's also just really important for everyone to understand that the school board only hires and manages the superintendent. So in some districts, there's other cabinet level positions, like in Cincinnati Public Schools, where I am, they also will hire the treasurer and the internal auditor. Some other districts, they might do that for the legal counsel. So that changes depending on your district, but everywhere it's the superintendent. And the really important thing to take away here is that board members should never be meddling in personnel decisions that have to do with the district office or school staff. So they don't oversee teachers and principals. And I know that's hard because especially when I was a school board member, that's what people come to you about the most, right? Is this teacher or this principal? And that's not actually the role of a school board member. So again, they only hire and manage the superintendent. And then finally, but most importantly, the board represents you, the community. And so they report to you, and that means they should be hearing from you, and they should be listening to you while they make their decisions. So that is a really quick overview of what school boards do. So we're going to spend our time tonight talking about why that matters. Why is that important? Those things we just listed out that school boards are responsible for. And so the first thing I want to talk about is policymaking. It was the first bullet on that slide. So policymaking is such a key function of school boards, and quite frankly, that's why lots of them are under the spotlight right now. So Ethan and Carrie, we're going to start with you. Can you talk to us a bit about the power school boards have when it comes to policymaking and how you've seen it create more equity in opportunities or access or outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, we're so glad to be here. Thank you for having us. And we're so excited to see so many people that are on the line with us this evening. I think, one of the things that we're very clear about with school boards is that they make critical policy decisions that directly impact students every day. I mean, whether it's the discipline policies of the district or the curriculum used or how teachers are placed, how students are assigned to schools, all these things play a huge role in outcomes for young people. And so, I think when it comes to policymaking, there's certainly policies that in real respects, have a big impact on whether or not, you have more equity and opportunities. But I think one of the most important things is like when we talk about, what does, policy that is equity focused mean? I think it's important to acknowledge that we're talking specifically about policies that are focused on, seeking to reduce disparities in access to resources, opportunities, and outcomes amongst young people, regardless of their backgrounds, right? And so, I think understanding that, there are certain policies that do that, and there's certain policies that don't. And I think, lean on my co-founder here, Carrie, to talk a little bit about, what those look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Is now when you want us to share some of the example policies, Elisa, or?
So we can get to that. So yeah, so thank you. So I think where that comes in is, I know in Cincinnati Public Schools, we did an equity audit, right? Where we looked through all of our policies to see where our policies might be inadvertently reinforcing inequities, right? And we saw that it impacted so much, everything from enrollment to, preschool admissions, so many different policies. And so I think it would be really helpful for constituents to know, how would they know if their policies were equitable or reinforcing inequities? And so I know you do have a couple examples to share with us of what each of those could look like. So Nona, would you share that slide? And then Carrie can talk us through it.
Yeah, and maybe just before I get into these examples, I might just say a couple of general things. I think there's two main ways to know if a policy is inequitable or not working for a segment of your population. One is to look at the data. And so basically anywhere you are looking at data and seeing a consistent, persistent disparity in any subgroups based on demographics, you've probably got a policy in there somewhere that is leading to that disparity. It's your job to figure out what that policy might be. And so that's when the second indicator comes in, which is your community is probably trying to tell you, or they've been silenced for so long that you really need to ask. And so that last bullet that Elisa said of just being in relationship and communication with your community, if you are listening to them, they will help you understand which policies are inequitable. And then you put that together with data, and you should have a pretty good idea. And I think, the other thing we talk a lot about is just the history of school board policies and the fact that many policies today have been on the books in a similar format to what you see today for many decades, really coming out of Brown versus Board of Education. And we just often say, like, school boards wrote those policies and school boards have to change them. And so just the weight of that is really critical. But we shared a couple of examples to go through tonight. One is a discipline policy. And before the revision, the discipline policy was really focused on punitive measures. Almost the whole policy was focused on suspensions and expulsions, and just wasn't very humane, certainly wasn't restorative. And so, we can share these red line examples if that's helpful, but they did a great job here of just summarizing some of the changes we made, which, here on the right, we added in all these examples of alternate steps that you could take with students before suspension or expulsion, where the previous policy just jumped straight to that. And so that was a really important step. We also, if I remember correctly, this policy reduced sort of the maximum suspension length from 10 days to 3 days. all sorts of steps in this policy. So this is just one example. We've helped our fellows either write or revise now nearly 100 policies, and they are incredibly meaningful. Like this policy, when passed, directly changed the life of students as soon as it was passed and implemented. So this was one example. I think the other example we sent in was for a superintendent evaluation. Elisa mentioned that one of the top 5 roles of a school board member is to hire and manage the superintendent, and the evaluation is just like the most underappreciated lever of power that we think school boards have. And so I don't know if you have that example in the deck here too. But basically the previous superintendent example before we worked with this district, that's okay. It was 1 page, it didn't really say anything. And so we added in all these specifics of, the data and the looking at subgroups and getting feedback from the community and doing a 360 review and, having an interim 6-month, check-in and just making the superintendent evaluation equity focused and much more robust, because what gets measured gets done. And so that policy, a lot of people don't even think of the superintendent evaluation really as a policy, but we would say it's probably like, at the top, everything trickles down from there, because what the policy of how you're evaluating your superintendent trickles down to everything else.
That is such a great point, Carrie. And I think many constituents don't know that that is open to the public, right? That's public record, is a superintendent evaluation. And so those were 2 really great examples. I'm assuming that the discipline policy was one that wanted to be revised because this district was seeing, as you just said, anytime you see numbers, you see data. So they were seeing disproportionate discipline data according to race, is what I'm assuming. Is that a correct assumption as to why it was inequitable before?
Yeah, that's correct. But also, just to name like the humans behind this came to be because one school board partners fellow, and she happens to be in this district, kind of a lonely school board member, really the only one focused on equity. And this was really important to her. And so we mentored her for over a year on the politicking, the rewriting the policy. And so the fact that she got this passed was pretty incredible. But yes, there were racial disparities and disparities with some other subgroups. And it really just took one school board member taking the initiative to get this policy changed.
That's fantastic. And so now that people on the call have some examples of kind of how to recognize if a district's policies are reinforcing inequity or not, what could they do?
I'm so sorry. For some reason, my computer cut out for a sec, so I missed that. But Ethan, if you heard it, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so I think the question is just around, and Nona, you can take this off so we can see their faces a little clearer. But yeah, so it's great if people, and I see people saying, well, what if my school board, if I know this stuff now, like what do I actually do about it? What can I do as a constituent?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, we've both got a couple of things to say here, I think. One is like the very first thing to do is just to start by attending or watching school board meetings and not even feeling like you have to speak. Like first, just listen to what the school board members are talking about. And AJ is the godfather of this. I hope he talks about it, but like if the adults in the room aren't spending their time talking about the changes that adults need to make for student outcomes to change, just note, like, what are they talking about? How are they spending their time? Then the next time, go and speak, like call them out, say, I voted for you, and yet I don't hear you holding the superintendent accountable. I don't hear you asking questions. I don't hear you guys talking about data. Write emails, that can make a huge difference. And then ultimately, it sounds like you might need a new school board, which is hopefully why many of you are here. And I know Ethan has other suggestions.
Yeah, no, I think beyond that, I think we are very clear to say that we put some tools and resources together at School Board Partners. One of them being an anti-racist rubric on what does it look like for a school board member and school board to be anti-racist. I'm gonna put that in the chat here. And so take a look at it. Evaluate when you're at your board meeting. Evaluate and determine, are you seeing the things that you would like to see from your board in retrospect to this tool. I think beyond that, we really want to make sure that you also get out and vote, right? Like that seems so, I think, in real respect, simple. But man, the numbers on school boards in terms of voting and the drop off is so serious, and we just got to make sure that we, the folks who chose to be on this call, all 91 of us at this hour, we're very clearly the people in in our communities who believe in school boards, and so we need to just make sure other people that we're at least getting 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 100 people to go vote with us when it's time to make the decision, because that really matters.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much. So as we're hearing, policy is such a key lever for change, right? And so it can be used to either build more equitable, inclusive districts or reinforce the status quo. So Ethan and Carrie, School Board Partners put out this revolutionary report, and I say that without hyperbole. I do not think school boards had been studied like you all have studied them ever. So we are going to chat in a link to their report called Empty Seats at Powerful Tables, the State of School Boards in America. That link is also in the handout for tonight because we want to make sure that you all can go back and read this. So like Carrie referenced earlier, there's this quote that I think I just kept going back to. It was so powerful. So in the report, you all say, America's school boards exercise considerable influence over public education. Historically, however, they have wielded that power to establish structural inequities. School boards enacted policies to preserve de facto segregation rather than embrace integration after the ruling of Brown v. Board. They built school finance systems, school assignment policies, and teacher contracts to privilege whiter and wealthier communities at the explicit expense of Black and brown communities. You go on to say school boards created these structural inequities and now must dismantle them. This session is called Why School Boards Matter. That is such a powerful statement about the importance of school boards. And so I just encourage everyone to read that report. And my question to you both is how? How can school board members dismantle these structural inequities?
Yeah, it's a big question, but it is a question that we focus on every day. I know it's a question that AJ focuses on, and I will tell you, for us, there's probably 2 or 3 main drivers. The one that is that we talked about and sort of really been highlighting here is changing policies. Man, I cannot tell you how many times I have been a part of conversations where the one lever of authority that you have, no one uses it in real respects. And they certainly don't use it in a way that tracks the data, make sure that things, in fact, are kept in a way that is talked about in measurable, thoughtful ways for the community to understand and be transparent. And so, changing policy is huge. And with that said, we all know that once you change policy, the implementation or the fidelity of the implementation of that policy is huge. And so also thinking deeply about how to change the culture of the district with that is huge. And one of the main drivers for that is what we talked about a little bit earlier, which is how you evaluate your superintendent and hold that superintendent accountable for the things that you as a board are saying, these are the things that are important to us. This is what we want to see in terms of outcomes change for young people. Here's the things that we want to see exist in, and we're basically going to grade you on that, superintendent, right? And if it doesn't come down to that reality, then you need to do one other thing, which is hire a new superintendent, get the right person who believes in the right culture, thinking about how to increase, again, student outcomes, ensure that their experiences and environments are healthy, whole places for them to be able to learn. And I think that's huge. And so, thinking deeply about changing policy and then changing culture is one of the huge things you have to do that to do it. But you can't do it before doing one of the most important things, which is you've got to have the majority vote. If you don't, if you can't politic and get more than one person to get you to follow you, you know, you're going to ultimately be on an island talking to yourself about the things that's important. And so you got to be able to also do the job of politicking and be a really good advocate for your community and district. So those are some of the three levers I'd say, and I know Carrie has something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, so we have this little framework that we call people, power, and professionalization. And Ethan talked a lot about the power section, which is like, once you're in the seat, how do you use your power? But our report also had really stunning data about the people and who's on the board and how they matter. And so just thinking about representation, we all kind of say representation matters, but the why just jumps out at you in this report about the differences. You know, why do white people run for school board versus people of color? What are our priorities? How do we view the, you know, the current state of the district? Huge disparities. You know, do we believe that systemic racism continues to exist in school boards? And so really, really important to have the right people. And, you know, all the data says, like, people of color, women, we tend to think that we're not qualified to be on school board. We are, you are, anyone is, and there's organizations like everyone here tonight that are there to support you. So if you feel like you have a voice that is not being heard, that is all you need to run for school board. And just to note that it seems like the online link to our report is broken. So we'll just drop the link in for the PDF and then get that fixed ASAP.
Can you just real quick before we move on from this, because where does the budget fit into that? So when we talk about how school board members can dismantle structural inequities, you've talked about superintendent, you've talked about policy. Where does the budget fit into that?
Yeah, it's such a huge component to, you know, making sure that the goals that you set are invested in real respect. So, you know, if you're saying we want to do something with student focused governance, but your budget doesn't reflect any of those goals that you just put out, then like you're lying to everyone. Like, you know, where you put your money will certainly show what you believe in. And so, you know, I tell people all the time when they're, you know, when we're coaching them, it's like, yes, we want to make sure that there's goals within the superintendent that's being held to the things that we believe in. But then you got to go pass a budget that is also, you know, directly linked to those goals. And if you can't get a budget that showcases how they're spending money to improve the things that you say you believe in, then someone is pulling the wool over your eyes. I just want to be clear about that. Those things are inextricably linked. And we got to figure out how to make sure folks are thinking about that, both on the community side and on the school board side. So all those things are huge. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's one of the biggest things that, you know, those things, the one thing I want to say is when you pass a policy, particularly around how you evaluate a superintendent and making sure there's goals, sometimes the process by which, when the budget is started and the process by which you're going to evaluate the superintendent, they don't always link. And so you have to be thinking deeply about those two things and how they link together, because you will think about them as if they're not critical with one another, but they are so critical with one another. So
yeah, I like to be really dramatic, but it's true, and just say, like, if your district has subgroups that are persistently and consistently not being served well by your district, then your district is misappropriating funds. Like, the board is not using their budget appropriately if disparities continue to exist. Full stop. You got to make some changes in the budget.
Yep. And I think we're going to start talking with AJ now about exactly this, right? About how are we going to make sure that everything we're doing is about student outcomes. And so we've been talking a lot about school board meetings. We're going to talk with AJ about how to find out in those school board meetings if we're talking about student outcomes. So you wrote a whole book about how school boards should be drivers of student achievement. So for those of you who haven't read it, we cannot encourage you enough to go read that. So as I've told you before, when I was a school board member, I was shocked when a few years into my term, I found out that not all my school board members thought we were responsible for student achievement. When I brought this up, I had a couple of my board members say, no, that's the responsibility of the people across the hall. And by that they meant, across the hall from the school board office was the superintendent's office and her cabinet. And so I was like, well, then what is our job? And they said policymaking and budget and finance. I was like, but to what end? Like, who cares if we've got a balanced budget if kids aren't learning? And so my first question to you, AJ, is, in your experience, is that a common mindset? And then if it is that coachable?
Yeah, and I appreciate the way that you asked the question, because this really is a mindset challenge. And there's a bunch of conditions that cause this to be a fairly common and likely dominant mindset across the nation, that there's this failure to distinguish why school boards exist from what school boards do. School boards absolutely adopt policies and budgets and all those things, but they don't exist for that purpose. That just is the mechanism we use to accomplish why we actually exist, which is to cause improvement in what students don't are able to do. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons that this particular group of humans are especially attuned to addressing, it is most common that board members across the nation don't have a full understanding, both that is in fact the job, that's why school systems exist, and that as board members, that's what we're here for, and any insight into how to actually bring that into reality. And so what happens is a school board will have spent time saying, hey, we talked about whether or not there are African-American students enrolled in our AP classes. So we talked about student outcomes, right? And the answer to that is no, actually you didn't. You talked about the adult inputs, the resources that have to be applied at the beginning of the cycle. But what you didn't actually talk about is the student outcome. What is the result that students experienced at the end of the cycle? Just because we made more seats available doesn't actually mean more students showed up to sit in those seats. And even if more students showed up to sit in those seats, that doesn't actually mean that we put the supports in place to make sure that they were actually able to be successful. And so this is the challenge, is that all too often folks will think that they actually are focused in on, are we moving the needle for children? Because they're focused in on the things that it will most likely take to accomplish that. All I think most of us are suggesting is that it is necessary but insufficient, that you have to both look at what is the result that we're trying to create, and you have to look at what are the actions that we're putting in place as a governing team to help move us in that direction.
Yes, and so along those exact same lines, you say throughout your book, and I know when you're not on camera, this is actually your screen. It says, student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And so what are the key adult behaviors on school boards that need to change in order for student outcomes to change?
Well, step one is there is no vision, the people perish. And in this context, the people is most definitely the children. And so unfortunately, what we see across the nation is we've been coding school board meetings for the last 3 years. We've got this initiative. I put the link in the chat box. It's just effectiveschoolboards.org, where we've been working with university partners across the nation to code school board meetings for the last several years, with the intent of looking at how are school boards across the nation spending their time. Most of you here who are school board members, we've probably coded at least one of your board meetings at some point, just to get an insight into what is it that school boards are doing, how are they investing their time. From those insights, what we found is that, one, most school boards aren't actually spending any appreciable time talking about our students learning. They're spending a lot of time talking about the adult inputs. What are the things that we think if we do these things that it'll be a blessing to children, but not finishing the task by looking at student outcomes. what is the evidence that the things that the adult inputs are actually generating the student outcomes. One of the other challenges that we've found from looking across these all board meetings all across the nation is that a lot of boards simply don't actually have goals that describe in any smart fashion what is it that we want our students to know and be able to do. And so in the absence of clarity about the vision and the absence of actually spending time talking about the vision, it can't be all that surprising that a lot of places the vision just isn't coming to pass. And I think germane to the conversation this evening is for our students who experience other safety nets in life, such that if their school falls off, there are other things that will buoy them up. This isn't horribly problematic. But for our students who are most educationally vulnerable, for whom there are not a sufficient number of safety nets supporting them, when they fall through our safety net, public education safety net, there may be nothing else to catch them. Those are the students who suffer most from our lack of effective leadership.
We always want people to walk away feeling like there's something they can do. And so once they've looked at the website, once they've listened to some board meetings, if their board isn't focused on student outcomes, what's your advice for this group? What could they do to get their boards more focused on student outcomes?
You know, one of the things that I found really valuable is actually starting outside of the school board. Have a conversation with parent leaders, student leaders, teacher leaders. What I find is that what unites many of us is there are shared values. And I think the thing we get twisted, and I learned when I was serving as a faith-based community organizer, that one of the things they taught us is that when people present an issue, push on that issue, because under the issue, after you push on it, you'll get to a value. And so the example of this I share in the book is there's a lady in my neighborhood who wanted a stop sign. Well, the stop sign was the issue. But when I pushed on that, why was the stop sign important to her? The value was safety. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways you could create safety, on a block other than a stop sign. We, on that particular block, we wound up going with a speed bump. Well, she didn't like having a speed bump on a block. She wanted a stop sign. What's important there is we didn't have a disagreement of core value. We both wanted the block to be safe. What we had a disagreement in was in the issue that we most wanted to apply. So the reason I say one of the things I'd encourage folks to do is start the conversation out in the community. People always have issues that they're pushing, but ask why a few times. Why is that stop sign important to you? Well, because these cars are going too fast. Well, why is that important to you? Well, these kids are trying to. And as you ask why a few times, you'll get to the underlying values. And what I think you'll find is people all across the community are going to have a lot of shared values that you could organize around, that you could build strength around. From a place of strength is always the superior way to engage with public officials. As public officials, we have so many different people kind of pushing us from different directions. And so if you really want to be heard, organize around shared values. And so, which means you actually have to sit down and listen to folks. You actually have to pull community together and hear their voices. Once you identify those shared values, then go together and visit with your elected officials. Here's a value that's really at stake for us. What can we do to support you as our public official in championing this value in your next school board meeting?